God's ways are not always our ways. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? God's ways aren't always your ways. Certainly aren't what we expect or maybe even what we want from life. Jesus offers today a different way to live. This different way of living isn't often our natural tendency. Self-denial, denying ourselves, taking up a cross and following Christ. We need to be perfectly clear and upfront right now. This idea of self-denial and this truth of taking up one's cross don't have a thing to do with a new diet plan or with anything like that. Cross-bearing is not about staying in abusive relationships. Many a well-intentioned Christian has met with someone encountering abuse from a spouse and guided them that the abuse is simply their cross to bear. No, abuse of any kind is never, ever someone's cross to bear. Abusers have manipulated for generations this notion of cross-bearing, and abuse is never acceptable. Jesus does not call us into a life of receiving abuse. Christ's way is the way of love, full stop. The kind of new life Jesus teaches about today is living selflessly. This isn't to say that we live without doing the things we want to do or that we become a doormat. We can still occasionally have soft serve ice cream maybe after a long Sunday, or we can go away on vacation if we're able to do so when the conditions are safe. No, dying to self is having the courage, and I believe that it's having the humility to put our selfish tendencies behind us and to be able to look with wider eyes at the greater good about us. To stop for a hot minute and consider God's will, God's place in the conversation. Because sometimes I think even we forget to invite God into the conversation. So often our hearts can be full of fear, maybe fear that we aren't enough. So we take on more, and we can take on more and more to prove to others and to prove to ourselves, and sometimes if we're down enough, to prove to God our enoughness. Been there, wrote the book, and I'll still occasionally pull it off the bookshelf and give it a read. To follow Jesus, we are called to pick up our cross. What on earth does picking up a cross mean for us today? We are clear that cross-bearing isn't about allowing others to manipulate. That's just her or his cross to bear. Jesus and the disciples were on the move. We're told earlier in the gospel section preceding this one, they were in the region of Caesarea Philippi, with Peter earlier responding correctly to Jesus' question about who do people say that I am, and then a little bit deeper into the more intimate question of, but who do you say that I am? He responds affirmatively, you are the Messiah. Peter shares this revelation, this epiphany of his about Jesus. And then, shortly after that, in our text for today, Jesus begins in on this idea of suffering, this rejection he would encounter, this death. And Peter doesn't want that for Jesus. He certainly doesn't expect that for Messiah. We witness a rebuke from Peter, followed quickly by a repute from Jesus, and it isn't pretty if we really get down in it and sit with it. It's uncomfortable. Peter and the disciples need to know that the Messiah's ways are not the ways of the world at all. We look at cross-bearing a little bit closer. Caesarea Philippi, where do we think the name of that region comes from? It's not about Little Caesar's Pizza. No offense to Philip Brandewie. It has nothing to do with the Brandewie family. This is where Herod the Great built the Temple of Augustus to honor Caesar. In about 4 BC, Herod willed the region over to his son Philip, who built up the capital to honor Caesar Tiberius. This was an area of great Greco-Roman influence and rule, a region that celebrated many, many gods. And under Roman rule, one that would keep the peace through the cross of crucifixion. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. This was actually a bold statement from Jesus' lips about not only living a life selflessly, that was part of it, but also speaking out against Roman imperial oppression. Jesus stood and he stands for liberation, both spiritual and physical. Christ's statement about the cross isn't in a spirit of timidity, but one of boldness. It's far too easy to get wrapped up in our own little worlds. I know it certainly is for me. I don't think it's just my issue either. I think that most of us find it, if we're honest with ourselves for a moment, that our thinking can quickly become myopic. Our thinking can become self-centered, especially when we're suffering even more. I think the more we suffer, the greater we can look at what is happening in our life and woe is me, that kind of, I can get there in a heartbeat. Jesus was absolutely on his way to suffering. Truth. The disciples would suffer too. Truth. They experienced new and authentic life, though, because they were able and willing with Jesus to stand up against the powers that be, and because they were able to keep Jesus the center of their attention. They didn't do it perfectly. We know that from Peter and others. They certainly didn't do this perfectly, but they were still able to look beyond themselves at God. Today's gospel lesson is a hard one. Today's isn't a feel-good one that we can say, when everyone ought to be here, and well, everyone should. But this is one that makes churches grow by leaps and bounds. This notion of cross-bearing and selfless giving. There isn't any amount of sugarcoating to make this message any easier for me to swallow. There is suffering, and when we suffer, we are to speak out against oppression. When we suffer, we are to do our best to try to think of the other instead of solely the self. Jesus invites us to join God's movement of selfless love. For most of the world, living other-centered is a whole new way of looking at life, a new life of living. I can get tripped up when I see the vast hurt and when I see the hurt and the suffering in the world. I know that I look in Reddit and in Flipboard and other publications and websites. I often see 10-step plans for living as a selfless follower of Christ in 2021. I haven't seen that exact one, but things like that, the 10-step plan for whatever. We don't need to read that blog anymore. We can start small. And remind me of this, because I need reminded of it too. Starting small doesn't get us off the hook of the gospel-centered justice we live in. It just gets us started. Help your family out rather than focusing on your problem today. I think all of us have problems, and we can focus on those problems and forget those around us, or we can choose to reach out our hand and help our family. Choose to extend a hand of love to another to see how they are. I know that the 2021 seems like it's a little bit better for face mask wearing, but I know there was a time when wearing face masks was made into something that it ought never have been. Wear a face mask in gratitude that we can help one another rather than out of frustration. I along with the best of us, I can walk up the walkway to the office and I can stand there with my hand trying to find my car key or my keys to the office, and where's my mask? And then I'm standing there and doing 80 things. I can't get this thing up. Stop. Just take a breath and put the mask on and recognize that this is a way of loving one another. Share a meal with your neighbor. If you've prepared it in a COVID-safe way and you have leftovers that you don't need, by all means, share it with a neighbor. They'd love that. We look at all the hurt and the sadness, and we can get bent on where can we actually begin. Start small and move forward. To a disciple who was forever complaining about others, his master said to him that if it is peace you want, seek to change yourself, not other people. It's easier to protect your feet with slippers than to carpet the whole of the earth. As a slipper wearer, I love that. It's easier to protect the feet with slippers than to carpet the whole of the earth. If we change our minds, if we change how our minds and our hearts think and operate, if we allow them to linger on God's love long enough, our outer selves will match our inner selves of Christ-centered love and peace and compassion. Then and only then we are able to die to self so that God can be birthed and born within us, to take root and to grow ever outward until our faces and our hands and our feet reflect that divine love of God. May we change ourselves, not others. Amen.